I'm Kathy McGady. I'm the Assistant Dean of Development and Alumni Relations for the College of Science and Technology. I'm so pleased that you could join us today for our Zoom into Science, Wildflowers and their resourcefulness and untamed beauty. Although the weather has been a little unpredictable lately, I think spring is finally here, which makes it a perfect time to learn about flower power and how wildflowers use their floral anatomy and diversity of rewards to attract much needed pollinators like bees. Today's presenter is Rachel Spigler, Assistant Professor in our Department of Biology. Dr. Spigler's research in plant evolutionary ecology spans the fields of population ecology, pollination biology, population genetics, and conservation biology. She has a particular interest in studying how plants adapt when fewer pollinators are available. We will have time to take questions after the presentation. You can enter your questions into the chat and we will follow up with them when the presentation is complete. Rachel, are you ready to begin? Rachel, you need to unmute.
Okay. Technical difficulties. Okay. Okay, are you able to see my slide there? Okay, wonderful. Well, thank you. It really is a pleasure to be here, particularly in this beautiful spring day when the flowers are starting to come out. And it's my pleasure to tell you a little bit about what I know about flowers. My title, the phrase, the untamed beauty of wildflowers, and where I got it from, was inspired by this quote by Lady Bird Johnson, a wildflower enthusiast herself, that almost every person from childhood has been touched by the untamed beauty of wildflowers. And I think that it's so true, the effect that flowers have on us. And as I was preparing this talk, I was thinking about it, and really it's since ancient times that flowers have been used by humans as symbols, as a way to express emotions, especially when we don't have the words to express them. And so this could be anything from love and using them in weddings to times of sorrow and sympathy. And in fact, we give them for every occasion, so much so that if you check your, let's see if there we go. If you check your favorite generic florist website, you will see practically every occasion that we now give flowers for, including everything from Mother's Day to St. Patrick's Day, to something I did not know existed, but Boss's Day. And I didn't click on it, but I am very curious to know what bouquets they have curated for that particular holiday. So flowers are important, and of course, they've also been an inspiration for works of art for centuries as well. So it's not hard to understand why humans are so inspired by them. Wildflowers are truly brilliant. They have extraordinary variation in color, practically every color in the rainbow you can find. And they have extraordinary variation in size. What I'm showing you here are the world's largest flower and flowers, and the world's smallest flower. So here in the upper left, we have a Rafflesia flower. These are native to Indonesia, and they can be 3 feet across and weigh up to 15 pounds, the single flower. Fun fact, smells like rotting flesh. And that is a cue that it gives off to recruit flies and beetles that they use as their pollinators. You may be more familiar with this one. This is Titan arum. It's can be up to 12 feet tall. It's actually an inflorescence. And it's usually a big deal when a place like Longwood Gardens or a local greenhouse, a university greenhouse might have one, because they bloom about once a decade. The world's smallest flowers are these little duckweed flowers. What you are seeing are the flowers. They're less than a millimeter of this aquatic plant. And even within closely related species, we see this variation. So here are just two examples of plant genera, Phalaenopsis, orchids on the top, and Collinsia, which is a genus that I study in my own research, on the bottom. And you can see, you can find everything from relatively large flowers to cute little teeny tiny flowers. They also display extraordinary variation in shape, and with that comes variation in their function as well. So some flowers will have nectar spurs. These are these kind of long spur-like tubes at the end where the nectar is at the bottom for pollinators to get access to, or conversely to exclude certain pollinators. Some flowers have radial symmetry, others bilateral symmetry. And then of course you get these kind of Dr. Seussian passiflora flowers as well, just quite remarkable. So much of this variation represents millions of years of evolution of these plants interacting with pollinators. And in fact, nearly 90% of flowering plants rely on pollinators to some extent for successful seed production. So here I'm showing you a set of pollinators that you might be familiar with, of course, the honeybee, but also we have many species of bees, 4,000 species of bees in the US. We have our beloved bumblebees, but we also have carpenter bees that are really good pollinators, and cute little solitary bees as well. Of course, butterflies, and in some places, birds are an important pollinator. In the United States, we have hummingbirds. In South Africa, that niche is filled by sunbirds. And in Hawaii, there are honey creepers, many species of honey creeper that pollinate, or specialist pollinators for particular plants. Some pollinators you may know less about, namely that many flies actually are pollinators, and good pollinators. Even wasps and mosquitoes are pollinators as well. This picture here is of a bee fly, and it's called that in part because it has this fuzzy body that kind of mimics a bumblebee and a long proboscis to get access to nectar. These here are called bee mimics. They're syrphid flies. And many people mistake them for bees, and that's the point of this coloration, to ward off predators, but they also are pollinators. Even these flies are the ones that are attracted to that kind of carrion smell of that Rafflesia flower and very similar flowers. What's really remarkable is there are other vertebrate pollinators. Now, another vertebrate flying pollinator, other than birds, are bats. Bats can be extremely important. Most cacti species are pollinated by bats. But remarkably, there are also examples of rodent, marsupial, and lizard pollinators. To me, this is the most striking. It was found on the island of Mauritius, where these lizards were found not only drinking the nectar, but also effectively transferring pollen from one flower to another, even lemurs, really quite fascinating. So these interactions are critical, not just to the pollinators and plants, but to us as well. You can thank a pollinator for 1 in every 3 bites of food you eat on average. And the estimates of the economic value of pollinators really ranges quite a lot depending on the studies you look at, but needless to say, it's quite important, in the hundreds of billions of dollars. I also just want to point out here that if you're a chocolate lover, not only can you thank pollinators, but you can thank this little insect here called a midge, which is its main pollinator. So unexpected pollinators doing fabulous things. So I want to briefly introduce you to the anatomy of a flower to talk more about pollination and what's going on and the problems that can occur. So when we look at a flower, most typically we're looking at a hermaphroditic flower. Not all plants are hermaphrodites. And what I mean by hermaphrodites is that they have both male and female gametes packaged in the same flower. So in this case, we can see these anthers. These house the pollen grains, which are the male gametes, and the ovules, which are the female gametes down in the ovary. Now, to get these ovules fertilized, the pollen first needs to be put on this part here, which is called the stigma. And even though the shape and the flowers may look wildly different, they have these fundamental parts that allow pollination to occur. Most of the time, we're talking about outcross pollination. So the movement of pollen from one flower to another through the aid of some agent. And plants are unique in that sense, that they rely on a third party to move their gametes around. It can be wind, But most of the time, like I said, 90% of the time, they're biotic pollinators. So it seems like a simple enough process: pollen from one flower, put it on another. There are actually many things that can go wrong, and the things that can go wrong in some way are what has driven evolution and the diversity that we've seen. So here are just a couple of ways that the process of pollination can go wrong. And the first of these is simply that pollen may never even reach another stigma. It falls off of pollinators, some actively broom themselves, or the pollinators are messy when they're visiting a flower and kick a lot off onto the petals. And so a very small fraction of pollen that flowers make actually makes it to another flower. That's in part why they make so many of those pollen grains, and why, well, especially for wind, why we have the allergies that we do for wind pollinated species. Now, the goal of outcross pollination is for this stigma to get compatible pollen, represented by these yellow circles here. So to get as much compatible pollen, meaning it's from the same species and it's viable. So it will produce a seed when it fertilizes the ovules. But when pollinators are bringing those pollen grains, they're often bringing other types of grains. So first, represented by the red and this kind of like sad squished symbol, are incompatible pollen. So maybe it's the same species, but it's genetically incompatible with the plant it's landed on, or it simply is desiccated or was aborted and never fully formed. In addition, because most pollinators are generalists, meaning that they visit many different plant species for nectar or pollen rewards, that also means that they often deposit the wrong pollen on the wrong species. We call this heterospecific pollen transfer. So in my lab, what we try and do is to understand why it goes wrong, where it goes wrong, and what the evolutionary consequences are. So we investigate, for example, the ecological conditions that are likely to lead to pollination failure. So these could include something having to do with the different types of pollinators themselves, or the effects of habitat fragmentation, or differences in resource availability. And we also study how natural selection works to produce solutions that, often imperfect, can make plants better at outcrossing, and the genetic factors that might either promote or slow down that evolutionary response to selection. And so I'm showing you these pictures just to give you an idea of places we work and what we do. Our work involves a lot of field work. I conduct my research, most of it locally in Pennsylvania. So we do a lot of field work, but we also have a plant facility in the BioLife building where I conduct a lot of experiments indoors, where I can control the environment. And we work in the lab, whether it's using microscopy to look at pollen grains or sequencing DNA to look at patterns of genetic variation. And if you are a frequent SEPTA rider, you might have been introduced to my lab through these advertisements at various train stations, which I love. These are two students, undergrads, that perform research in my lab, who've now both since graduated. And we were really thrilled to be a part of this advertising campaign for CST. So I want to give you just a few examples of some of the results we've found related to pollination failure. And one of these has to do with the fact that in small populations, plants face some pretty fundamental problems, the most of which is that there are very few mates around. And so in my research on this plant here, this is a plant called Sebacia angularis. It grows in these grasslands. And on the left here, what I'm showing you is the amount of pollen that you can find on average on a given flower in populations of varying sizes. So what I want you to see is that the smallest of populations, and this is a log scale, the smallest of populations receives very little pollen on average. That amount increases, I don't know if you can see my cursor, that amount increases linearly up to a point. And in fact, we have this Goldilocks situation where it turns out that after some optimal population size, the mean pollen per flower actually drops. So this side's easy to explain. It literally comes down to not having enough mates around and there not being enough pollen around. But in the large populations, here we're talking about maybe populations that could have 1,000 individuals. There are plenty of mates, but now there's so many mates that they're competing for access to the pollinators that are there. So that pollinator competition results in fewer grains per flower in the largest of populations. In addition, when you are relatively rare in a flowering community, what that means is that, again, with a generalist pollinator moving around, you're more likely to receive the wrong pollen. And we were able to show this here as you increase population sizes, or I should say, as you go down in population size, your probability of getting the wrong pollen is almost certain. And we've shown similar patterns in this other species, Onifera. What I want you to take away from this is, first, we see the same relationship with respect to other mates. So conspecific means of the same type. So again, as you have fewer and fewer of the same type, you are more likely to get the wrong pollen. But most importantly, who comes to visit you matters. Not all pollinators are created the same. And we found that in particular, small bees are particularly inefficient. This yellow line represents flowers that were visited by small bees, and the blue line represents flowers that were not. They were visited by large bees, large flies, for example. And what you can see is, regardless of who is surrounding you, you're always going to get more heterospecific pollen or the wrong species pollen when you depend on small bees. So how do plants face these challenges? With the few minutes I have left, I'm going to run you through some particularly spectacular, some maybe less so spectacular, but highly effective. Now, the first of these is, well, if some pollinators are not effective, maybe it pays to specialize. Now, this is the exception rather than the rule, but those exceptions give us the most brilliant examples of evolution. On the left here, I'm showing you a picture of what's known as Darwin's orchid. This orchid has a nectar spur that can be up to a foot long. And remarkably, there is a moth that has a proboscis that is also about that same size. And this is a tightly co-evolved relationship between this moth species and this orchid species. For the plant, what it means is that the nectar can only be accessed by this moth that is a very good pollinator, and it excludes bees, flies, other species that maybe aren't the best pollinators. For the moth, it's a guaranteed source of nectar that it doesn't have to compete with other pollinators. More bizarre are what are called pseudocopulatory or sexually deceptive orchids. The orchids really are the star of the show when it comes to specialization. This is an example of a hammer orchid. Now, what these orchids do is they try and mimic female wasps. They mimic them in shape, in texture. There's lots of hairs. Most importantly, they mimic them with respect to a pheromone. They produce an odor that is very similar to the pheromones of female wasps. In this plant in particular, this female, what they do behaviorally is they climb, they're flightless, they climb to the top of a blade of grass and they wait. So this is what this orchid is doing. It's mimicking that. And when the male comes, it tries to copulate with the flower. It gets smacked with the pollen that it then realizes I'm in the wrong place at the wrong time, tries it all over again, often ends up on another orchid, and then deposited the pollen. And we see this actually in quite a number of species of orchids, also for bees as well as wasps. Now, those are pretty extraordinary examples, but most plants, again, are generalists. And oftentimes it's simply a matter of being patient and waiting to receive enough of the right pollen. So when I'm talking about being patient in terms of flowers, I'm talking about something called floral longevity. So I'm sure many of you have had flowers on your table. You get this beautiful bouquet, and then like the next day you notice some of the flowers already have their petals that have dropped onto the table. And then if you're like me, you forget they're there, and then a week later you realize, oh, they're there. And maybe one or two flowers are still looking pretty perky. This variation is something that's reflected in the wild, in natural variation in plants. Some species have flowers that can last for over 20 days, like orchids over here. Many species have flowers that last a single day and then they wilt. And we know from other studies that this longevity across species is correlated with the environment that these flowers have lived in, the pollination environment. So longer lived means pollinators, you've evolved in a space where pollinators are not abundant. In my own research, I've also showed that even within a species, plants can be highly flexible in terms of how long their flowers live in response to the rate of pollination that they're getting. So these are data that I conducted in our plant facility, where I can control everything from the climate to certainly no pollinators. And some we pollinated by hand, and others we made sure they got no pollen. What you can see is that flowers that are pollinated last on average about 5 days, and flowers denied pollen will live on average 12 days. And some of them looked perfectly fine and lived up to 20 days. So they're incredibly flexible. And we've done other studies in the field where we found that this extension of floral longevity serves the function to essentially let those plants catch up when they're being visited less often, for example. So it can be a good strategy for plants when pollen will come, they just need to wait. Now, finally, sometimes waiting won't cut it. Nobody's coming for you, or no one's around. This often happens in cases of colonization. So for example, maybe a bird drops a seed or two in a different grassland and that species isn't there. So when that plant grows up, it's got no mates. It also happens when there's pollinator failure, meaning really just dramatic declines in pollination, or in some harsh environments where, for example, extremely dry environments where there's a very short growing season and plants need to carry out their life cycle really quickly. So one way to do this is by self-pollinating, meaning don't rely on pollinators, figure out a way to get your own pollen on your stigma. And this has occurred, this transition to become self-fertilizing has occurred so many times across flowering plants. In fact, it's the most, or one of the most common evolutionary transitions. And even more fascinating is that when we see this shift to high selfing, where plants are no longer reliant on pollinators, we see a common syndrome that they all display. They tend to have highly reduced flowers that have low or no scent or reward, less pollen, and the flowers live a very short time. So everything you don't need if you don't have a pollinator. Here are some remarkable examples. These are morning glories, a self-fern and outcrosser, a self-fern outcross mimulus, and then also different mimulus, self-fern outcrosser. And then even within a genus, again, this is a genus I work in, Collinsia, we see this independently evolved at least 7 times. Now, this is what we call parallel evolution. And so we can see it within this genus and across angiosperms. And it's a very strong signal that natural selection is at play in leading to what's called the selfing syndrome. And so what I'm doing now in my lab, a large part of my projects are looking at this parallel evolution in this genus Collinsia. And we're doing a series of studies to understand whether or not we get the same result, in other words, the selfing syndrome, because of similar ecological conditions, or whether they're different. And also using genomic approaches to understand whether maybe this is so common because there's very few routes to get there, or maybe because the same mutations, the same genes are being under selection. So thank you so much. And I, of course, love talking about flowers and pollination. So if you're interested in learning more, feel free to reach out. Thank you.
Thank you, Rachel. If anyone has any questions, you can put them in the chat. Or actually, it's a relatively small crowd, so I would say welcome you to unmute yourself if you want and ask a question. But Rachel, I think one question would be interesting if you could tell us, all the gardeners on board, is there something we can do in our own gardens, in our own yards to help nature do what it needs to do?
Absolutely. It's a great question. And the answer is yes. So I can tell you a few things, but I actually put a few things up here in this list for people. And I highly recommend that people check out this pollinator.org, which has lots of information. In short, the 2 best things you can do are to plant native plants that are good sources for pollinators. So local native milkweeds that are native to Pennsylvania that monarchs and many other butterflies rely on. But it's well known that it's native plants that are what the native pollinators need. It turns out they don't do as well if we have plants from other parts of the world that they haven't co-evolved with. The other is the use of pesticides. These pesticides, some say they only kill mosquitoes. It's very hard to get targeted pesticides. They often influence bees, and even some of the agricultural pesticides, even the new ones have shown to be very harmful. So reduction of pesticides, native plants are the two best things that gardeners can do.
Thank you. Are there any other questions? No? No questions? We have a shy crowd today.
Kathy, I'll shoot one out. It's Mark.
Hi, Mark.
Just wondering, what the influence on the decrease in like honeybees and the impact of that?
Sure. So honeybees get the most attention. They're kind of the powerhouses that we rely on for agriculture. What I'm personally, as a biologist who studies wild populations, I'm most interested in the conservation of native and wild bees. They actually do an incredible job of pollinating as well, and often better in some circumstances. But we do see effects. I mean, one of the things that I study in my work is habitat fragmentation. And certainly southeastern Pennsylvania has a nice gradient going from Philadelphia out towards the Susquehanna. And we see differences in pollinator composition, depending on whether a patch of grassland is closer to urban areas. And we see negative pollination consequences as a result of that. And there have been a number of studies. However, there are some pollinators that are not as affected, so non-bee pollinators that are not as affected by climate change, for example. So flies are often neglected as pollinators, but particularly syrphid flies can be extremely important as well.
Thank you.
So Rachel, we do have a few questions in the chat. The first one is, Kimberly's curious about the prevalent use of mulch. Does this affect pollinators?
I don't know. I can't, I suspect not, unless it's treated with something that could be harmful to the pollinators. And if you have ground nesting bees, then they would find somewhere else to nest. So I think, I suspect that if it's treated with something, that would be the problem, but not the mulch itself.
And another question we have is, do you have any comments about pollination and veggie output?
And what?
And vegetable output.
Do I have comments? They are good for vegetable output. So, well, actually, interesting story, and this goes back to one of the questions about pollinator decline. So apparently in parts of China, they are known for their pear production. And because it's thought, because of the use of pesticides, that their pollinator populations have dropped so dramatically that they pay people to pollinate pear trees. And I didn't have time to tell you about that, but humans wind up having to get involved and do the pollination, because for many crops, they must have pollinators or else they won't set seed. Other crops are self-pollinating. Strawberry plants, pollinators increase yield, but they can self-fertilize. In fact, a lot of the breeding for strawberries, I used to work on a strawberry breeding project. They want selfing species because then they don't have to worry as much for pollinators. But by and large, so many crops, like what I think 35% of the crops require pollination.
That's great. Any more questions?
Yeah, this is Bob Sanders.
Go ahead, Bob.
Okay. Hi, Rachel. You mentioned carpenter bees, and my garage is filled with them. And I plant for pollinators, by the way, but I'm tired of seeing
one of those like carbon offsets. Sorry, go ahead.
Can you control just carpenter bees? I haven't figured out what to do with them. I just let them buzz around me.
I don't know the answer to that. I can tell you can you just make them a little hotel? I don't know how much damage they do. I mean, what they're doing is, my understanding is they don't have big hives. What their individual
They're individuals, it seems.
Yeah, they're individuals that are just need a little home to provision for their young. But I don't have a good answer for that. But I'm
Okay.
glad you plant native plants. I think I wouldn't spray for them. At the very least, you can mechanically cover up holes, but maybe
No,
they'll
I
go
haven't
somewhere else.
sprayed. I haven't used pesticides in 20 years. So anyway, good talk. Thanks for giving.
Thank you.
Do we have any other questions? Okay, so thanks so much, Rachel, for all that great information. Now I'm going to go find some more native plants to plant out back. So thank you so much for that suggestion. And thank you to everyone for joining us today. We hope you get inspired to go out and not only enjoy the wildflowers, but take some of Rachel's suggestions to help our pollinators. So again, thank you so much for joining us. CST will be planning some more Zooms into science in the future. We hope you will join us. But in the meantime, look for us on Twitter, Instagram, Facebook, and as well as our alumni newsletter and on the college's website. Thanks so much for joining us, and I hope everyone has a great evening and a great weekend.